that we should be doing something about it urgently, and that's about to come out this week, and I think that will have a lot of power because already it's producing kind of anguished expressions of denial from Republican presidential candidates in America who are Catholics. That they could previously reconcile being a Catholic with being super keen on oil and all the nasty things that pay for them being politicians. But now they've got to have a real difficulty when this encyclical comes out. They have to decide whether what comes first. So I think it's already, before it's even published, it's having a beneficial effect. Well, if it's really drastic, then I think we can. We won't be able to avoid 2 degrees of warming, but we can maybe stop it if we can develop CO2 removal. We can stop it before it gets to, say, 3 or 4, so we can gradually bring things under control, or at least reduce the rate of warming to the point where it is possible to adapt to it. At the moment, it's accelerating to the point where we can't adapt. But so I think if we take really serious action, and it has to be really serious now, that we can sort of survive.
Hello and welcome to the Environmental News Network. We are filming from the lovely Constantia Valley with helicopters flying overhead, birds tweeting all around us, and I am basically going to cover some information that is deemed extremely important in terms of the environment, and it is actually extremely important. I mean, it's actually crazy important, but you sitting there in your house may or may not be aware of this. But it is actually so important that we've gone out of our way just to reiterate certain points of this. So the story actually starts a long, long time ago, but the part that I'm going to start with is the Great Barrier Reef, which was the first kind of point that it started becoming to everyone's attention. As some of you may or may not have heard, the Great Barrier Reef has been in slow decline over a period of time, and what is known as coral bleaching, which is basically this beautiful, lovely, luscious coral. It basically bleaches into this dull grey or dull white kind of shade due to lack of nutrients and ocean acidification. So a report was released roughly about 3 weeks ago, in which it's the most comprehensive study ever done on the reef, which they're saying that roughly 83% of the Great Barrier Reef is now dead. The question is whether or not, remember that, the question is whether or not the Great Barrier Reef will be able to recover from such an event. And it is deemed extremely unlikely that the Great Barrier Reef is going to be able to recover. So as a result of this, people have taken some dramatic steps. They've basically gone and they're looking at doing things that neutralize the pH content of the top surface of the water in an attempt to basically remove the acidification problem that is causing the bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef. The problem really is, though, is that what's happening on the Great Barrier Reef is not a micro problem. So it's not a local problem. The problem that's happening on the Great Barrier Reef is actually a macro problem. And what that means is that there is no action that can be taken by any person in Australia, New Zealand, any of the surrounding islands. There is absolutely nothing that they can do about it, because what you are really witnessing is the impact of the macro event of climate change that is having a direct impact not only on the Great Barrier Reef, but on reefs all around the world. And what that means is that if you start looking at the kind of articles we've put out much news articles about this that's been published rather widely, and there is kind of social activists that are trying to start campaigns, save the Great Barrier Reef, save the Great Barrier Reef, all over Facebook, Twitter, and various other groups. But the reality is that there is absolutely nothing that can be done to save the Great Barrier Reef, because it's a macro problem caused by overall climate change. So the thinking behind the Great Barrier Reef, if you understand that it is like the heart of the ocean. I mean, there nowhere else in the world is such a diverse, large kind of place in the ocean found with such a density of life. So in a way, it's like the heart of the ocean. When you and I don't know how old you are, where most of us, a lot of us were born, the Great Barrier Reef was an abundant, beautiful place. And inside of our time, we're actually going to see the death of the heart of the ocean. And, no social activism is going to stop it. The only thing that is going to stop it is if we eventually kind of move away from this idea of climate change. But bearing in mind that 83% of the reef is already dead, the probability of us being able to stop it is almost zero. So then, sorry, I've just been corrected. It was 93% of the reef is dead. That's actually right. So then it brings us to another component. So now take that story and throw that story on one side of your mind, okay? And then it comes to another part of the story. Now they were looking, a study was recently done on what is causing ocean acidification. But while they were studying that, they were looking at oxygen levels inside of the ocean. Now, there is a relationship between the volume of plankton that is present in the water and their ability to sequester carbon dioxide. The ocean, despite what you may have heard, is actually the largest sequesterer of carbon dioxide. And when I say sequester, I mean that it takes in carbon dioxide and releases oxygen. So the ocean is actually the largest, what we call a carbon sink. So it's bigger than the rainforest, bigger than any other arboreal forest, it's bigger than anything that we have done. The ocean actually does most of the work. So most of the oxygen that you're breathing comes from the ocean. I'm going to come to that point in a little bit. I'm just going to explain a bit about the dynamics of what's happening in the ocean. So basically, plankton are responsible for bringing oxygen from the surface of the water, bringing carbon dioxide from the surface of the water, and they harness that as they keep the carbon, they release the oxygen. But because the top surface of the water has been heated, because of the amount of sunlight that is impacting on the ocean, the plankton are no longer able to reach the top surface of the water. And thus, even though they are still filtering some carbon dioxide that is resident, because that's what acidification is, it's an increase in carbon dioxide, it's mainly carbon that they're picking up, and there's less oxygen going around the ocean. So the report came out that basically said by 2030, you would start to see off all shores, you would start to see obvious signs of lack of oxygen inside of the water. And there's another report that came out, but it's kind of minor by comparison, but it's still significantly important, is that the plankton is responsible for bringing that oxygen right from the top surface levels right to all the levels going down the marine chain as far as it can. And what this does is it enables a healthy marine environment where creatures are of all different kind of levels in the ocean are capable of eating or breathing. So with the loss of oxygen in the water, with the reduction in oxygen in the water, and with the growing kind of losses of oxygen in the water, the impact on marine life is projected to be devastating. Devastating. So what you're talking about is the loss of massive marine chains. So where you and I now can walk into the store and pick up like fish, a large proportion of those fish are they're dying. They're dying. So because they're just dying of suffocation, there is nothing for them to actually breathe. So the impacts, the knock-on effect impacts that this has is dramatic. So now if you take that and put that in the side as well, along with our little story about the Great Barrier Reef, what you're left with is an interesting little study that's been done, and something that we've actually here at Brave Green World, we've been monitoring for quite some time. In fact, it was a question that was raised a while back. When you were in school, you got taught, so you said, like, how much oxygen is actually in the atmosphere, okay? So the common phrase that we throw around is 21%. 21% of oxygen is available in the atmosphere, which means that for every breath that you take, you're taking in some helium, some argon, some oxygen, but of that, 21% is actually oxygen. Now, if you understand the fundamentals of climate change, what they're saying is that there's an increase in carbon dioxide. So from combustion, like we're burning carbon, from kind of, exhaust, carbon monoxide. So from all of these things, there's a combustion process that's taking. It's what's called oxidization, which means that in order to release carbon in the form of smoke or byproduct, it has to attach itself to an oxygen so that it becomes lighter and it floats up. So that's how you get carbon dioxide, which means that there's a direct mathematical relationship between the volume of carbon dioxide versus the volume of oxygen. So some studies were done about this because what we wanted to find out was what is the actual oxygen. You can't have an increase in carbon dioxide without having a corresponding decrease in oxygen. So we wanted to see what studies were done in relation to the amount of atmospheric oxygen that's available. And so far, the results are kind of sketchy. Scientists actually blatantly stated in the document that they just don't know. So they've done some recordings. Some cities, they've picked up oxygen contents as low as 14%, some as low as 17%. And these are just patches. If you imagine patches floating around above cities that are deoxygenated. And now you can see it all starts to make sense. Inside of your ocean, you're now getting patches of loss of oxygen. Inside of your atmosphere, you're getting loss of oxygen. And those same losses of oxygen are starting to have an impact on the marine ecosystem, which is in turn having an impact on what you're seeing in the Great Barrier Reef. And so, for the first time, actually, all the little pieces of a puzzle are starting to coalesce into one big story. And that story is happening right now. Right now, as I say this, it's happening. And what are you and I really capable of doing about it? Nothing. What are you and I capable of bringing about some kind of change that will affect it? We are powerful. But this has got to be bigger than some social media campaign. This has got to be a fundamental change in the way that we're going about doing business. What it means is that there's greater level of sunlight that is hitting the ocean. The ocean is absorbing more heat because all it is really energy transfer. So there is more energy inside of our atmospheric system than there is outside of our atmospheric system. And what that does is it starts to heat up the top surface of the water. And because the top surface of water begins to heat up, what it really does is anything. It's the same thing that happens with any water. If you heat up water, it expands. As there's more energy absorbed by the ocean, there's lower oxygen inside of the ocean. There's greater ocean acidification, which is reducing plankton. And ultimately, it is now starting to have an impact not only on marine-based kind of oxygen levels, but also on atmospheric-based oxygen levels. And this is a story that is actually more serious than anything you're going to hear. It's more serious than anything that you're going to read. It's more serious than anything that you're actually going to uncover this week. And you can put it in your head, you can do what you like with it. But the fact is that if you take a look, and I'm just going to reiterate why ENN is actually important. If you look at what the news was covering inside of this week, we covered things on CNN like Trump. We covered a whole lot of rubbish that's related to events on the field. But why is nobody talking about this? Because this, in your lifetime, no longer is it 2100, the fame, this is when we'll see the effects of climate change. We're talking something that is only 14 years away before you are going to see significant changes in the oxygen content of the surface of the ocean, and thus it's going to impact those that eat seafood. It's going to impact the entire marine chain, and it's going to impact oxygen levels. And when scientists were asked, what happens if the oxygen levels get to a low point? What is the net effect? What is the safety level for human beings? You know what they said? They don't know. They don't know. Now think about that. Just put that in the back of your head. Remember, for all of you that are going to be watching Donald Trump go on and attack Hillary Clinton, and you're going to watch Bernie Sanders try climb all over Clinton and how important that is, the reality is that day by day, the oxygen content of this atmosphere that you're relying on to watch those things is actually running out. So I want to thank you for your time in watching ENN. Remember that this is the channel that is going to bring you actual news, real news, that's actually important to you and actually has meaning to not only you but everybody else on Earth. ENN is the one channel where you're going to actually find out the things that are important. So thank you for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.
My name is Pete Bethune and I work for Earthrace Conservation, which is a New Zealand-based NGO. New Zealand is probably the best managed fishery in the world. We have a lot of focus there from the Navy and the Air Force, and the Ministry of Fisheries work very closely with them, and of all the countries that I visited and looked at their fisheries, New Zealand is arguably the best managed, and one of the reasons is they have a total focus on the maximum sustainable catch, and so they base it on numbers, they base it on science, and they develop what is the maximum you can take out of this resource without letting it get depleted. And every year the quotas are managed and adjusted depending on what's been caught over the last year and how healthy the fish stock is. And you may have, for example, through climatic conditions, you might have a fish species takes a big hit and is dropped not because of fishing but because of climatic conditions. In most countries their quota remains the same. In New Zealand they adjust it down or up as the need be, and I think it's where a lot of countries can make big inroads in terms of their fisheries management is by focusing on a maximum sustainable catch rather than simply a quota. Some fisheries in New Zealand have been suspended and some have been dropped drastically, and it tended to be a long time ago. Like now with the fisheries management as it is, it's adjusted annually, and I don't know of it happening recently because they've gotten on top of it, but in the early days of the quota management some fish stocks were suspended. In fact I know of one. They stopped commercial fishing of blue cod in the Marlborough Sounds where it got hit too hard, and part of that was also recreational catch where there was a significant recreational catch inside the area. So it does happen from time to time. That's part of managing a good fishery. The trouble you have with just a straight percentage of pristine is if you're trying to manage it most effectively, you want to base it on the maximum sustainable catch. The percentage of pristine is a measure you can use, but I think at the end of the day you really want to be focusing on what is the most we can take from this resource with it remaining at a sustainable level. And as soon as you start dropping down below that, you need to adjust your quota. The only fishery we have that's at risk are the pelagic species, so especially the tuna that migrate from Tonga, Fiji, Samoa down through our waters, and that fishery has been hit enormously hard, and it's largely out of our control. You know, those fish are taken in international waters and in the waters of island nations who maybe don't have the resource that New Zealand does to go policing it, but all of our other fish species, I believe, are sustainably managed. Maybe one exception, the toothfish, which New Zealand and Australia have kind of claimed as their own, and they issue permits for vessels to go fishing in Antarctic waters when really New Zealand and Australia has no jurisdiction over them, and there's not a lot of science to say that is sustainable. But outside of the toothfish, I think all the rest of our fisheries are reasonably managed, with the exception, I say, of the tuna, which are a pelagic, and we don't have control of those species. I think you've kind of got two issues here. One is the management of your own fishery, with the fishery within your reef system and around your coastline. The second one is these pelagic species, and that is much harder to go managing. And you know, how do you control fishing in international waters? There's really nobody that has jurisdiction to go out there and do enforcement. And I do fear for the the pelagic fisheries, that they will be largely wiped out. You've already seen it, for example, the northern bluefin tuna. I think in a few years it will be all but gone. And you're seeing that now with the yellowfin tuna, the big-eyed tuna. There's many of those tuna species. They are being hit way too hard. A lot of it in international waters, and nothing's being done about it. There is talk, and I've heard in the year 2040 and 2050 of the ocean being entirely jellyfish, and I don't think that's quite true. But there will be large sections of ocean and coastline where I believe that will be the case. You'll find that there will be an increased amount of local extinction, so given species will be fished out locally, and it takes those areas a long time to ever come back. If ever, sometimes there's irreversible change. If you fish a fish stock out completely, is it going to regenerate from it? Can't. And so, long term, there will be areas that become jellyfish only, most definitely. I think fish will be on our menu, but I do see it becoming more exclusive for the wealthy. At the moment, if you look at coastal Africa, such a large percentage of their animal protein intake in coastal Africa is fish, and I think that will change with time. You are seeing it already. There's a push towards having more animal protein from land animals, so things like kudu and reptiles and all sorts. And I think that trend will continue until Africa gets on top of its coastal fishery.
I am Tor Glistrup. I'm working in Directorate of Fisheries of Norway. I also work with the Interpol Fish Crime Working Group. This seminar is an important happening to start the work where we can also use the Interpol tool to hit the top target organized crime in fisheries and related crimes. What I could wish is that we could enforce this work and increase it, and that more countries involved with resources on intelligence, on surveillance and analysis. If we don't take this threat on fish resources seriously, we might end up in a huge problem for the food security for the countries. FAO reports says that in 2050 the world will be 9 billion people, creating an increase of food also from the sea with 50%. That's the need for the future. And when the resources are going down and the need for protein from the sea increase, then there will come a huge problem. And the stocks around the world are in bad shape. So we need to go fast in this direction. And then there is a lot of things one can wish that would happen. We need a better ground for us who operate on this, on the high seas. For instance, look at the law of the sea, paragraph 110. Is that good enough for us? We need to have perhaps a permanent organization who work with this, perhaps under the UN system, within the UN system. And we also need capacity at sea. Why cannot Marine and Coast Guards also be involved here and help us to build capacity at sea, on the high seas? These are major things for us to work on, and if we could achieve more on this, we will be better off in the future. This seminar is the first on fish crime, and from before we have the IUU regulations and systems around the world, but we need this tool to hit those top organizers who take illegal benefit of what is the world's common resources and put it in their pockets and destroy the possibility to manage these fish stocks around the world in a good manner. And we are absolutely it's quite necessary for us to work fast, and so this is a very good start for that part of the work against illegalities in the fisheries. We should have started this perhaps years ago. And we need to improve very fast, and we need more countries to involve. So if we are not able to improve and have more resources into work on this, that will be bad for the resources. The countries have to look at their penalty codes, the criminal code in the countries. Because these actions, these violations we see here, they are about fish, but nobody's in this for the fish, they are in this for the money. So we need to improve to use the ordinary penalty codes, because the police, they understand that. Everybody have a problem to have the cases through the police system, it seems. And when you put it into that context, they are used to it. That's their everyday life. Then it's not so complicated for them. And it levels up the reactions on this, because that's white-collar crime we actually are dealing with. These 6 vessels that we have been hunting have been operating for 10 years, but now they have been stopped within this operation that we have done, for a period anyway. It's peculiar that there is no more no good thinking on this around. They have to find test cases. I did that in 1998 in Norway. I came from the police. I worked there for years. Why this is not this is like stealing, as Bernard and any other have said here. So we must put the frame on it. This is ordinary white-collar crime. And then the system acknowledges that, and you will have another reaction. And the sanctions in Norway for that, then the top level is 6 years imprisonment, instead of just a fine and pay off every each time. The Russians have their own, in their penalty code, they have paragraph 256, as I can recall, makes it illegal to harvest illegally, and then but it in the right law. So they are using that more and more. We don't have that in Norway. Other countries might have it, but so the penalty code use that.
I think at least the next generation of the children, they still will have the future. But the future, they will have a very sad future.
Frankly, I believe my children and the especially grandchildren, not only my children, my grandchildren don't have a future, because the impacts which we already see now are so effective that one has to realize there is a problem and we have to solve this problem now.
The big thing, though, is going to have to be a systemic and structural change in the way that energy is produced and distributed, because nothing else will do.
The days of where we could dump all this toxin into the sea and just get away with it are numbered.
Take shipping. It's 1 billion tons of CO2. If it was a country, it would be the 6th largest country in the world, in between Germany and Japan. On a SOx, NOx and PM level, it's even worse. One large ocean-going vessel pollutes the same as 50 million cars.
The issue of acting on climate change, on sustainable development, is not always portrayed as preventing people from doing something. First step is to do things more responsibly. Secondly, to look for more intelligent answers. And then you can, from there on, begin to develop a whole set of steps.
The New York Times a few days ago, and in particular, the quotes in the second paragraph: even with a deal to stop the current rate of greenhouse gas emissions, scientists warn the world will become increasingly unpleasant. But then it goes on to say, without a deal, they say the world could eventually become uninhabitable for humans.
The other thing that we need to push is the enormous economic opportunity for this generation of investing in energy, clean energy.
So maybe I can tell a little bit about what has been done by through the framework of the ASEAN Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So this issue is really a major transboundary. It's a regional issue because previously the fires were predominantly in Indonesia, but the smoke from the fires were covering five countries in the southern ASEAN region. And that galvanized all of the countries to come together through the framework of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And we as an NGO from Malaysia, we have worked very closely with the Secretariat of the ASEAN since 1997-98, and that led to the agreement in 2002 by the 10 member countries that they really need to tackle the issue of peatlands. Initially they were just saying smoke, forest fire, in general we need to organize aeroplanes, we need to organize firefighters to go from the countries. But we pointed out that majority, like 90% of the smoke is coming from these particular peat fires. The fires on peatland were only 15 or 20% of the area burned, but produce 90% of the smoke because the fires persist and burn much longer, produce so much more smoke, as well as so much more greenhouse gas emissions. So we really highlighted to the countries the need that they need to focus on peatlands, and that was basically agreed by the governments collectively in 2002, led to the creation of an ASEAN Peatland Management Initiative. Subsequently, the countries agreed to a strategy, a roadmap up to 2020, identified the main elements within that, and we have been progressively working through those mechanisms, basically by saying that rather than Indonesia alone trying to solve the problem, let's harness the knowledge and skills and approaches of the other countries in the region as well. ASEAN has a policy of consensus, not direct intervention, but working together, the concept of working together. And in fact, it's not only Indonesia that has this problem. We have 5 of the ASEAN member states that do have fires in peatlands, but not to the extent of the Indonesian fires. So we have had a very effective program bringing everyone from top officials to local government, to local communities, to indigenous people together and sharing and seeing what other countries are doing and learning from what's going on. And we have found that there's a lot of learning from countries like Thailand, which have one of the smallest area of peatland, but they have treasured the peatland because they have lost and degraded it in the past, and so they have protected the small amount remaining, and they have 25 years of how to restore degraded peatlands. Indonesia have never tried at the time how to restore them. They said we have so many, so why bother? And so the exchange from Indonesia and Malaysia to Thailand helped everyone learn, okay, that we can restore these back. Everyone said it was impossible to restore, and the Thai experience showed people that they could, and now we have quite large rehabilitation programs in Indonesia and Malaysia building on the Thai experience. Also a lot of experience in Thailand, Philippines, on the community involvement, community engagement, community livelihood, which has also been shared effectively with the other countries. So this approach of regional sharing, South-South cooperation, has been a very effective tool, and that has also helped at the political level of understanding that this is something collective, that the collective experience can contribute to solving the problem, and there has been empowered a process, supported a process at the regional level, which is making a difference. However, it's the scale of the problem. When we're talking about millions of hectares of degraded system, vulnerable to fire, and then we have one of the worst El Nino droughts that we have had, the second worst ever recorded, then everything is very vulnerable to fire. Then we only need a limited number of irresponsible people to start fires, and then they can spread well and not be controlled. It was not helped this year because of the change of the government. The government in Indonesia changed president in October last year. In his wisdom, he reorganized all of the government ministries responsible for environment and forestry, merged many units together to create a more integrated approach, which was positive, but inadvertently that led to so much reorganization that there was no clear prevention strategy put in place before the fire started in the middle of the year. But now they've learned from that problem and they're trying to move forward, but still we will have to see whether they're successful. The El Nino is expected to continue and strengthen to June next year, so we're expecting in the dry season from February to April there are likely to again be large-scale fires unless good prevention is done.
Steve Johnson, and I'm Professor of Biology at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. The field of research is pollination biology, so I look at the interactions between plants and animals with respect to pollination. So most of the world's plants depend on animals to pollinate their flowers, and pollination in turn is the process that gives rise to seeds. So for plants to have a new generation, they need to be pollinated and to be able to produce seeds. In an ecological context, pollination is important because it's part of the network of interactions between species that maintain life as we know it. But pollination often happens in the middle of the night or at a time that you may not see it. So part of the challenge is to actually figure out what's going on with the flowers and their pollinators. And this is involves a lot of running around after insects and trying to see what they're up to. There's a worldwide concern about decline in honeybees. This is often in the newspapers and so on. And this does seem to be a real phenomenon, and it's largely a result of disease because bees are kept in close proximity to each other. In South Africa, it's because of hybridization between two different subspecies of honeybees that causes problems. So people took Cape honeybees to the northern parts of South Africa, and then they hybridized with the African honeybee, and this resulted in all kinds of behavioral problems in the bees. There are also various issues with pesticides and lack of forage for bees. So if you remove the fynbos from the local habitat of bees, they might have flowers for part of the year, but they wouldn't have flowers for the whole year. So managing honeybees involves having a source of pollen and nectar throughout most of the year, which fynbos is, of course, it's a good source of pollen and nectar. So fruit farmers in a valley like this depend on honeybees. They usually pay for the hives, but those hives are kept elsewhere and usually depend on a mixture of fynbos and also some introduced plants like blue gums for nectar. And there's some controversy around blue gums because bee farmers benefit from the nectar from blue gum flowers. So although blue gums are invasive plants, there's some argument to keeping stands of blue gums for the benefits of maintaining bee colonies and also for honey production. So this dependence on paying for managed hives could be reduced if the farmers in this valley used their local fynbos to support bee populations. And in an ideal scenario, the farmers themselves would have some sort of local organization that keeps bees using the local fynbos, and during the time that the fruit trees are flowering, one would bring the hives into a close concentration to make sure that all the flowers of the fruit trees get pollinated. I don't think that, in most cases, you probably couldn't just leave these orchards to be pollinated by bees from the wild, because if the local fynbos is more attractive to the bees than the orchards, then the bees won't come into the orchard. So you usually have to bring the bees in during the night so that they are almost forced to feed on the fruit trees. And then, of course, when the fruit trees are finished flowering, you can take the bees back into the fynbos. So honeybees are an interesting connection between wild habitat and farming. So they kind of provide an ecological connection between them. And I think most farmers are starting to recognize that fynbos is important for their farming enterprises through the services it provides in terms of water and food for honeybees. But one should also bear in mind that many, perhaps more than half of all Cape plants are pollinated by insects other than honeybees. So although in the public's imagination honeybees are the pollinators, in fact there's a whole variety of other animals, even vertebrates like sunbirds, that keep the whole ecosystem going.
And are there any of those at risk?
Yes, so yesterday we noticed that many of the plants that we expected to be pollinated by long proboscis flies were not getting pollinated, and we struggle to find any of these flies, which suggests that there may be something in the land use pattern in this valley that's resulted in a decline in some of these long-tongued flies. Maybe poison, or perhaps also alteration of the larval habitats. So horseflies need wet, marshy areas for their larvae, and if these are transformed, made into dams or made into fields, then it's plausible that that could be the reason for the decline in the flies. And of course, if the flies are not there, the plants are not going to get pollinated. They won't set seed, and eventually the population will disappear. The plants we're talking about, these Cape bulbs and so on, are the plants that humans enjoy aesthetically. They're the plants that can often attract tourists to a particular area. So flowers are part of the attraction of the Cape region, and any diminished number of them would make the area depauperate and less attractive. But ecosystems work in a way that many species are needed to keep the whole thing going. We spoke earlier about how long-lived animals need flowers throughout the year. So if any of those parts of the chain are missing, then the system is less able to cope with change and disturbance. But if a single orchid species went extinct, we wouldn't feel it as humans. But as more and more become extinct, then the consequences are felt. The only way we'd feel it as humans if a rare orchid went extinct was having. It's like losing a rare piece of art, for example. You know, if somebody stole a rare Renaissance painting, probably none of us would really feel it, but the world would be poorer as a result. So I see rare species in the same way as archaeological artifacts or rare paintings, or something unusual buildings, something that is part of the makes the world interesting. That if we lost it, we'd be poorer for it. Well, with respect to climate change, it depends on the scenario. So, at the worst case scenario for climate change would obviously push species beyond their physiological limits. So species wouldn't be able to exist in the areas that they occur now, which would mean probably quite widespread collapse of ecosystems, because you would have new arrangements of species that are not physiologically compatible. Pesticide use in South Africa is fairly unexplored, so we don't really know the consequences. It's been intensively studied in Europe, but there's very, very few studies on the effects of pesticides on pollinators in South Africa.
Would you like to see that?
So, yeah, I think it needs to be done. Probably on an area-by-area basis. So the spraying, for example, in sugarcane probably has different consequences to spraying in fruit orchards, for example. So yeah, and in terms of water, the link between pollinators and water is very indirect, in the sense that water depends on natural vegetation. So natural vegetation provides the steady supply of water throughout the year, and natural vegetation to persist requires pollinators, but there isn't a direct link.
As you see pictured here, this is a volcanic carbon dioxide vent, and it's a naturally high carbon dioxide system. Similarly, upwelling regions are naturally high carbon dioxide systems. So today's upwelling regions can provide a window into what future marine communities will look like. To understand upwelling, you can imagine the ocean as a layer cake. So we have deeper layers and we have surface layers. In upwelling regions, those layers are disrupted, and you have your deeper water being brought up to the surface. This deep water is cold and nutrient-rich, which supports high fisheries production. However, the water is also high in carbon dioxide, which means it's low in pH, it's more acidic, and it's also low in oxygen. I'm a graduate student at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and I live near an important upwelling region off of California. This upwelling region supports many productive fisheries that support our economy as well as recreational fishermen. So where are the upwelling regions of the world, and is there an upwelling region next to your coastline? The ones that I'll be focusing on today are the eastern boundary current regions and the equatorial upwelling region, and you see those circled on the map. And these upwelling regions support productive fisheries around the world, for example, on things like sardines and anchovies. And we see fishermen in Mexico, here in Peru, in Chile, in Namibia, in India, and then also in the US, depending on these productive fisheries in these upwelling regions. So we need to focus on upwelling regions because they both provide a window into what future marine communities will look like if the ocean becomes more acidic and less oxygenated, but also because right now they're very important economic areas, and because they may be vulnerable to changes in ocean acidification because they're already naturally low pH areas. From ocean acidification experiments, we know that there are certain marine organisms that are vulnerable to ocean acidification. These are calcifying mollusks and corals, and they have a harder time building their calcium carbonate shells under these lower pH conditions. In modern-day upwelling ecosystems, we do see calcifying mollusks such as oysters and mussels. However, reef-building corals are found in very few upwelling systems today. Furthermore, in upwelling ecosystems, you don't just have to worry about acidification. We mentioned that the characteristics of that water is that it's also very low in oxygen. And this is important because some of the groups that we've seen in studies to be more resistant to low pH conditions, so not as vulnerable to ocean acidification, are the same groups that are very vulnerable to low oxygen. And so in these conditions, fish and crustaceans will be impacted by both stressors, the low oxygen and the low pH. For my PhD, I'm interested in these multi-stressor effects on bottom communities. And particularly, I'm interested in how pH change and oxygen change and temperature change affect bottom fish communities off of California. Although we've talked about how upwelling areas are naturally high carbon dioxide, more acidic areas, they're not immune to the effects of ocean acidification. And in fact, ocean acidification has been observed in multiple upwelling areas. And with the changes in chemistry that have been observed, we've also seen negative impacts on calcifying mollusks. The consistent findings are that things like oysters and mussels and pteropods and abalone are being negatively impacted by these declining pH conditions in upwelling systems. We also see changes in community composition, in the organismal physiology, to the greater level of populations and communities of marine organisms, and then to the food web, because it's a healthy food web that sustains our fisheries. And the US is doing a great job monitoring ocean acidification off of our coasts. What about other developing countries like Mexico and Namibia and India that just don't have those same resources but are in these really important upwelling regions? Since upwelling regions are so economically important, we have to think about how ocean acidification is interacting with other climate stressors to affect these marine communities. And I leave you with this take-home message that some of our most productive fishes may be the ones most vulnerable to the impacts of ocean acidification.